Beneath the glamour of old Hollywood lies a vault of secrets, sealed, silenced, and long buried beneath red carpets and golden trophies. The stars of the silver screen weren't just icons, they were human beings tangled in webs of pain, deception, and dysfunction. From sibling rivalries that turned deadly to hidden children, secret lovers, and double lives, these family stories were deliberately masked to protect reputations and careers. But the truth has a strange way of resurfacing. What we're about to reveal isn't gossip. It's the dark underside of Hollywood's most beloved icons, the raw reality they fought to hide. And for some of these stars, the biggest acting performance of their lives was pretending their families were normal. Number 1. Tony Curtis, the father who denied Jamie Lee. At the height of his fame in the 1950s, Tony Curtis was the epitome of Hollywood charm. Slick, handsome, fast-talking. With hits like Some Like It Hot and Sweet Smell of Success, he became a cultural icon. But behind the smile and matinee idol persona was a man grappling with deep emotional wounds and creating new ones that would haunt the next generation. Curtis's relationship with his children, particularly with actress Jamie Lee Curtis, was fractured and distant for most of their lives. While he publicly acknowledged her as his daughter, he was married to her mother, Janet Leigh. Privately, he kept her and her siblings at arm's length. After Tony and Janet divorced in 1962, Jamie Lee was only a toddler. What followed was years of silence and estrangement. Tony remarried 5 more times. With each new wife, he seemed to drift further from his children, emotionally and physically. Jamie Lee Curtis would later admit in interviews that she hardly knew her father growing up and described their relationship as disconnected. Even as she rose to fame in her own right, her success did little to repair their broken bond. But perhaps the most shocking revelation came not in life, but in death. When Tony Curtis died in 2010, his will made headlines, not for what it included, but for what it deliberately excluded. He had disinherited all of his children, including Jamie Lee. Not a single dollar, no explanation, no farewell message, just a legal erasure. The decision devastated his family and stunned the public. Jamie Lee, always poised in the spotlight, never made a public scene, but her grief and quiet heartbreak spoke volumes. Why would a father so celebrated for his charisma and warmth be so cold to his own blood? Friends and biographers suggest the answer lies in Tony's own upbringing, abusive, poverty-stricken, and emotionally barren. His unresolved trauma became a legacy he unconsciously passed down. He couldn't give what he never received. Hollywood saw Tony Curtis as a legend. Jamie Lee saw him as a ghost. 2. Joan Fontaine. Sisterhood turned into hatred. She won an Oscar, starred in Hitchcock classics, and carried herself with grace and elegance. But behind the poised exterior, Joan Fontaine lived in the long, dark shadow of a rivalry that would define and destroy her personal life. Her bitter feud with her own sister, Olivia de Havilland. Born just 15 months apart, Joan and Olivia were raised in a tense, competitive household. Their mother, Lillian, seemed to pit them against each other from an early age, encouraging comparisons in beauty, talent, and affection. By the time both sisters entered Hollywood, the seeds of jealousy had already been sown. When Joan took the stage name Fontaine to differentiate herself from her rising star sister, some saw it as a professional choice. Others knew better. It was the first major crack in what would become a lifelong war. In 1942, Joan Fontaine made history as the only actor ever to win an Academy Award for a Hitchcock film, Suspicion. That night, as she accepted the Oscar, her sister Olivia sat in the audience, tight-lipped. Rumor has it that Olivia didn't even congratulate her. But the real storm came in 1947, when Olivia finally won her own Oscar. When Joan reached out to shake her hand backstage, Olivia turned away. Cameras caught the snub. The media feasted on their tension. But what no one saw were the decades of cold silence, legal threats, and family betrayals that followed. When their mother died in 1975, Olivia didn't invite Joan to the funeral. The sisters hadn't spoken in over 2 decades. Joan would later write in her memoir, No Bed of Roses, that she and Olivia were like cats from the same litter, raised in a cage too small. The bitterness ran so deep, they died estranged. Olivia passed away in 2020 at the age of 104, never reconciling with the only person who could truly understand her life. It wasn't just a sibling rivalry, it was a lifelong civil war, and their battlefield was the golden age of Hollywood. Number 3. Peter Lorre, A Daughter Forgotten. With his haunting eyes and eerie performances, Peter Lorre became one of Hollywood's most unforgettable character actors. From M to Casablanca to The Maltese Falcon, he carved a niche as the sinister outsider, often playing villains, madmen, or tortured souls. But behind the camera, Lorre's real-life role was far more tragic, that of a father who vanished from his own child's life. In 1953, Lorre welcomed a daughter, Catherine, with his third wife, Anne Marie Brenning. For a brief time, it seemed the actor had found peace. But that illusion wouldn't last long. Struggling with chronic pain, addiction to morphine, and deep depression, Lorre's world began to spiral. He distanced himself from friends, turned inward, and most painfully, began detaching from his daughter. By the time Catherine was just 5 years old, Lorre was nearly a ghost in her life. After his death in 1964, she was left not only with grief, but without support, inheritance, or connection to her father's legacy. Lorre's estate was in shambles, and what little remained went to his widow. His daughter was effectively cut out of his memory, both financially and emotionally. In later years, Catherine Lorre Bayer would speak out, revealing how she grew up in near obscurity, despite being the child of a Hollywood icon. She struggled with abandonment, poverty, and isolation. In 1984, she became a national headline herself, briefly kidnapped by the so-called toolbox killers, who later released her when they realized her identity. As if life hadn't already haunted her enough, she died in 1985 of complications related to diabetes at only 32 years old. Her name barely made the news. No Hollywood tributes, no family recognition, no flowers. The world remembers Peter Lorre as the unsettling genius of noir cinema. But to his daughter, he was a phantom, both in life and in death. 4. Ingrid Bergman, exiled for love and motherhood. To the world, Ingrid Bergman was the epitome of grace, an international screen legend with a luminous presence in films like Casablanca, Notorious, and Gaslight. But in 1950, at the peak of her fame, her name became synonymous with scandal, not because of what she did on screen, but because of what she did in her private life. While still married to Swedish doctor Petter Lindström, Bergman fell in love with Italian filmmaker Roberto Rossellini. Their affair was passionate, electric, and profoundly public. When she became pregnant with his child, the backlash was swift and merciless. She gave birth to a son, Roberto Jr., out of wedlock, and Hollywood turned on her overnight. She was branded immoral by politicians and blacklisted by studios. In 1950, a U.S. senator stood on the Senate floor and condemned her as a powerful influence for evil, calling her personal conduct a threat to American values. Film roles vanished. Invitations stopped. Even custody of her daughter Pia from her first marriage was contested and strained. The press dubbed her child with Rossellini a bastard and painted Bergman as a disgrace. The woman who had once been adored for her innocence and poise became a symbol of betrayal and foreign deviance. She exiled herself to Europe, away from her Hollywood life, and for a time, from the daughter she loved. Though she would eventually return to the screen and reclaim her reputation with an Academy Award win in 1957, the damage to her personal life had already been done. Her children, scattered between continents and households, carried the scars of a mother torn between love, duty, and survival. Years later, Ingrid admitted, "I left one child for another." It was a confession layered with both honesty and pain. Hollywood never forgave her completely. But the deeper tragedy was that her own family paid the highest price for her defiance of tradition. Number 5. Tippi Hedren, the mother who fought the studio and lost her daughter. To the public, Tippi Hedren was the icy blonde discovery of Alfred Hitchcock, the ethereal star of The Birds and Marnie. But off-screen, her life was anything but pristine. Behind her Hollywood break was a psychological battle with one of the industry's most powerful men. And behind her legacy was a painful fracture that affected her relationship with her daughter, Melanie Griffith. Hitchcock plucked Hedren from obscurity, but his obsession with her spiraled into a controlling nightmare. He isolated her on set, restricted her movements, and demanded absolute submission, not just professionally, but personally. When she resisted his advances, the consequences were brutal. He sabotaged her career, refusing to release her from her contract and blacklisting her from working with other directors. But what wasn't visible to the public was the ripple effect this control had on her family, especially her only child. During her harrowing time working under Hitchcock, Tippy's daughter Melanie was often left in the care of others or in the proximity of the very sets where trauma was unfolding. Hedren would later admit she was consumed by survival, stuck in a gilded cage of contracts and cruelty. And then came another tragedy. When Melanie Griffith was just 14 years old, Tippy allowed her to star in Roar, a film Hedren co-produced with then-husband Noel Marshall. Marketed as an adventurous family project with big cats, the set became a disaster zone. Dozens of crew members were injured by lions and tigers, and Melanie herself was mauled by a lion, requiring dozens of stitches to her face. The film was a box office failure and a haunting chapter of misplaced trust. In later interviews, Melanie spoke about loving her mother, but also feeling confused and neglected during key moments of childhood. Their bond, while strong in public, bore the strain of choices made in survival mode. Tippi Hedren survived Hitchcock. She fought the studios. She tried to create something her family could own. But the cost was imprinted in scars, emotional and physical, on her daughter's body and soul. Even the best intentions can unravel when power, ego, and desperation take the wheel. Number 6. Anthony Perkins, the secret that consumed a family. To the world, Anthony Perkins was Norman Bates, the chilling, boyish killer from Hitchcock's Psycho. But behind the curtain of that performance was a man trapped in a far more complex and terrifying role, that of a husband, father, and closeted icon forced to live a lie. The secret he guarded with his life eventually tore through his family with devastating consequences. Born in 1932, Perkins lost his father, actor Osgood Perkins, when he was just 5 years old. Raised by a strict, emotionally distant mother, young Anthony developed deep insecurities, especially about his identity. As he entered Hollywood, he quickly gained fame for playing conflicted men. The irony? He was one himself. In the conservative climate of mid-century Hollywood, homosexuality wasn't just taboo, it was a career killer. Perkins had intimate relationships with several men, including tab hunter and choreographer Grover Dale. But he was forced to keep everything secret, engaging in conversion therapy and leading a double life for decades. In 1973, at age 41, Perkins shocked many by marrying actress and photographer Barry Berenson, a woman 12 years his junior. Some believed it was a cover. Others insisted it was genuine affection that transcended gender. Together, they had 2 sons, Elvis and Oz. But Perkins's demons never rested. The fear of exposure, the trauma of repression, and the decades of silence took a toll. In the late 1980s, tragedy struck. Perkins tested positive for HIV, a diagnosis he kept hidden from the public until his death in 1992. Barry, loyal and loving, never spoke publicly about his illness during his lifetime. She protected his image to the very end. But the pain didn't stop there. Just 9 years later, Barry Berenson was killed on American Airlines Flight 11, the first plane that struck the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001. 2 sons, 2 parents, one taken by a virus that thrived in silence, the other by an act of terror that shocked the world. The Perkins family was marked by grief, stigma, and secrets, some imposed by Hollywood, others by history. And when the truth finally surfaced, it came with a double blow that no scriptwriter could have imagined. Number 7. Joseph Cotten, A Love Story, silenced by stroke and secrecy. Known for his roles in classics like Citizen Kane, The Third Man, and Shadow of a Doubt, Joseph Cotten was a refined presence in Hollywood, a Southern gentleman with a crisp voice and effortless gravitas. But few people know the devastating secret that haunted the final decades of his life. A personal tragedy he kept hidden from the public, involving the woman he loved most. Cotten was married to British actress Patricia Medina, a woman he often described as his soulmate. Their marriage lasted over 3 decades, unusually stable by Hollywood standards. They were known for their warmth, mutual respect, and a quiet life away from tabloid drama. But behind closed doors, fate dealt them a cruel hand. In the late 1980s, Patricia suffered a massive stroke, one that rendered her nearly mute. For a woman whose life had been defined by voice and performance, the loss was devastating. But rather than place her in long-term care or hire help, Cotten devoted himself entirely to her. He became her caregiver, her interpreter, and her full-time emotional anchor, often without telling even close friends the full extent of her condition. Cotton's own health declined around the same time. He suffered a stroke that robbed him of his speech, followed by a laryngectomy that removed part of his voice box. The couple, once known for their conversations and public charm, were now silenced together, communicating in glances, gestures, and touch. And yet, Hollywood barely noticed. Cotton stepped away from public life, refusing to make his wife's condition a spectacle. He shielded her from the public eye, never exploiting her suffering for sympathy or relevance. In his memoir, Vanity Will Get You Somewhere, he hinted at her illness with grace and restraint, but never detailed the toll it took on them both. When Joseph Cotton died in 1994, it was without a media storm or long obituaries. Just a quiet end to a life that had once danced across the screen in black and white brilliance. Patricia Medina lived another 8 years, mostly in silence. Their final chapter was one of love, loyalty, and private pain. A story so human, so heartbreaking, it's astonishing how few ever knew. Number 8. Jackie Coogan, the childhood star robbed by his own mother. Long before Macaulay Culkin or Shirley Temple, there was Jackie Coogan, Hollywood's original child superstar. Discovered by Charlie Chaplin and immortalized in The Kid, 1921, Coogan became a national sensation. By the age of 10, he was one of the most recognizable faces in America, earning millions in a time when that was unheard of. But while the cameras loved Jackie, his own family saw him as a golden goose. And when his fame faded, the betrayal that followed was unthinkable. Throughout his youth, Coogan's earnings were entrusted to his mother and his stepfather, Arthur Bernstein. Jackie believed the money was being saved for him. But by the time he turned 21 and asked for access to his fortune, he was met with a cruel shock. Nearly every dollar was gone. His mother refused to give him a cent. In a chilling statement to the press, she said, "No promises were ever made to give Jackie anything. Every dollar a child earns belongs to the parents." They had used his money to buy luxury cars, real estate, and live lavishly, all while Jackie struggled with depression, PTSD from a devastating car crash that killed his father and best friend, and the collapse of his film career. The scandal outraged the nation and led to the creation of the Coogan Law in 1939, legislation designed to protect the earnings of child performers, requiring a portion of their income to be placed in a trust. Jackie's personal tragedy became the backbone of reform, but the damage to his life was irreversible. The boy who had once charmed the world spent his adult years fighting for scraps, eventually finding a modest second act in the 1960s as Uncle Fester in The Addams Family. Behind the dark comedy of that role was a man who had lived through real horror, not from monsters or ghosts, but from the betrayal of the very people who should have protected him most. He didn't just lose money. He lost trust, innocence, and a childhood he never got to own. Dean. Shirley Temple, Hollywood's darling behind closed doors. She was the face of America's hope during the Great Depression. With her bouncing curls, radiant dimples, and unforgettable smile, Shirley Temple became the most beloved child star in Hollywood history. Her films brought joy to millions, and her image was carefully crafted to represent innocence, optimism, and charm. But behind the applause and perfectly rehearsed routines, Shirley Temple lived a childhood shaped by intense pressure, exacting control, and financial mismanagement that would haunt her into adulthood. From the age of 3, Shirley's life was orchestrated by her ambitious mother, Gertrude Temple, who managed every detail, from her signature hairstyle to the way she spoke in public. Her father, George Temple, was in charge of her finances. Shirley quickly became the top box office draw in the world by the time she was 6 years old, commanding salaries that rivaled or surpassed adult stars. However, as Shirley matured and eventually stepped away from acting, she learned that the fortune she had earned, estimated in the millions during her peak, had been greatly diminished. Poor financial oversight, risky investments, and lack of safeguards left her with only a fraction of what she had made. This personal loss would later help inspire conversations around the importance of child performer protections, echoing the reforms sparked by Jackie Coogan's earlier case. Equally complex was Shirley's emotional experience. Her childhood was consumed by work, constant filming, rehearsals, press appearances, and an unwavering demand for perfection. There was little room for spontaneity, free time, or emotional space to simply be a child. In her memoir, Child Star, she reflected on the surreal nature of growing up under such scrutiny, noting that she often felt like a product rather than a person. To her credit, Shirley Temple navigated her early fame with extraordinary resilience. She retired from acting in her early 20s and built an entirely new career as a diplomat, representing the United States as ambassador to Ghana and Czechoslovakia. She became one of the rare child stars who successfully transitioned into a life of service and public integrity. But the cost of that early success was steep. Shirley's youth had been turned into an empire, one that profited nearly everyone around her, but left her with lingering consequences she never chose. Hollywood gave her the spotlight, but what she really needed was a childhood. Number 10. Farley Granger, the star who hid in plain sight. In the post-war era of Hollywood, Farley Granger embodied the boyish, sensitive leading man. He was elegant, introspective, and magnetic on screen, especially in Alfred Hitchcock's Rope and Strangers on a Train. Yet off-screen, Granger lived with a secret he could never fully share with the world, a secret that colored every personal decision he made and every relationship he kept at arm's length. Born in 1925 and thrust into stardom at a young age, Granger quickly found himself navigating a Hollywood that prized image above all else. While other stars hid marriages or age, Farley carried something far more complicated: his sexual identity. In a time when being openly gay or bisexual could end a career overnight, Granger was forced into a careful, lifelong balancing act between authenticity and survival. Throughout his years in the spotlight, he was romantically involved with both men and women, including composer Leonard Bernstein and playwright Arthur Laurents. But these relationships were either kept quiet or only spoken of in coded language. The pressure to conform, to maintain the illusion of heterosexual masculinity, was immense. Studio contracts in the 1940s and 1950s often included morality clauses, and public image was meticulously controlled by agents and publicity teams. For Granger, this meant interviews that danced around the truth, staged photo ops with actresses, and a persistent feeling of isolation. He wasn't alone in this struggle. Many stars of the era faced the same dilemma, but the silence was often deafening. In his 2007 memoir, Include Me Out, Granger finally told the truth in his own words. He recounted the emotional toll of living under constant scrutiny and the sadness of being unable to fully acknowledge the people who had shaped his life most deeply. It was a quiet, dignified act of self-reclamation, one that arrived decades after the peak of his career. He never apologized for who he was. But he also never got the chance to live openly while the world was watching. Farley Granger's story is not one of scandal or public downfall. It's the story of a talented man forced to dim his own light for the sake of others' expectations. And in that quiet suppression lies one of the most painful family secrets of all, the one where you must hide yourself. Number 11. Anna Kashfi, the mysterious mother of Marlon Brando's troubled son. She entered Hollywood wrapped in exotic mystique, billed as an Indian beauty with a mysterious past. But Anna Kashfi's greatest role may not have been on screen. It may have been the identity she constructed, and the truth behind her life unraveled in painful, personal ways, especially for her son with Marlon Brando. When Kashfi married Brando in 1957, it was a media frenzy. She was elegant, soft-spoken, and carried an enigmatic aura. Studio press releases described her as a British-educated Indian actress from Calcutta. But soon after the wedding, tabloids and investigators began to raise eyebrows. Records surfaced showing she had actually been born Joan O'Callaghan, the daughter of Welsh parents living in India. The truth, or versions of it, remained murky. Kashfi fiercely insisted that her cultural background was genuine, despite mounting contradictions. For Brando, a man drawn to complex women and defiant spirits, the mystery only added to her allure at first. But the marriage unraveled in less than 2 years, leaving behind a child, Christian Brando. What followed was a bitter custody battle marked by volatility, legal fights, and accusations. Kashfi and Brando fought over Christian for years, with Kashfi even allegedly arranging to have the boy kidnapped and taken to Mexico in defiance of court orders. The custody tug-of-war left deep emotional scars on Christian, who struggled with identity, direction, and emotional stability for most of his life. Kashfi's own later years were marked by seclusion and estrangement. Her son, Christian, would eventually be convicted of manslaughter in 1990 after the fatal shooting of his sister's boyfriend, a tragedy that shattered the Brando family and made national headlines. Some close to the family suggested Christian's turbulent childhood and conflicted parental relationships had contributed to the darkness he fell into. Anna Kashfi passed away in 2015, still surrounded by questions about who she truly was. Whether she was an actress caught in her studio's marketing machine or a woman who deliberately reconstructed her identity is still debated. But the cost of the confusion wasn't paid by the tabloids. It was paid by a child born into chaos, whose life became a mirror of the secrecy and instability that began with a name. Nashrab 11. Anna Kashfi, the mysterious mother of Marlon Brando's troubled son. She entered Hollywood wrapped in exotic mystique, billed as an Indian beauty with a mysterious past. But Anna Kashfi's greatest role may not have been on screen. It may have been the identity she constructed. And the truth behind her life unraveled in painful personal ways, especially for her son with Marlon Brando. When Kashfi married Brando in 1957, it was a media frenzy. She was elegant, soft-spoken, and carried an enigmatic aura. Studio press releases described her as a British-educated Indian actress from Calcutta. But soon after the wedding, tabloids and investigators began to raise eyebrows. Records surfaced showing she had actually been born Joan O'Callaghan, the daughter of Welsh parents living in India. The truth, or versions of it, remained murky. Kashfi fiercely insisted that her cultural background was genuine, despite mounting contradictions. For Brando, a man drawn to complex women and defiant spirits, the mystery only added to her allure, at first. But the marriage unraveled in less than 2 years, leaving behind a child, Christian Brando. What followed was a bitter custody battle marked by volatility, legal fights, and accusations. Kashfi and Brando fought over Christian for years, hot with Kashfi even allegedly arranging to have the boy kidnapped and taken to Mexico in defiance of court orders. The custody tug-of-war left deep emotional scars on Christian, who struggled with identity, direction, and emotional stability for most of his life. Kashfi's own later years were marked by seclusion and estrangement. Her son Christian would eventually be convicted of manslaughter in 1990 after the fatal shooting of his sister's boyfriend, a tragedy that shattered the Brando family and made national headlines. Some close to the family suggested Christian's turbulent childhood and conflicted parental relationships had contributed to the darkness he fell into. Anna Kashfi passed away in 2015, still surrounded by questions about who she truly was. Whether she was an actress caught in her studio's marketing machine or a woman who deliberately reconstructed her identity is still debated. But the cost of the confusion wasn't paid by the tabloids. It was paid by a child born into chaos, whose life became a mirror of the secrecy and instability that began with a name. Number 12. Marlon Brando, a family torn apart by fame and tragedy. Few figures in cinema loom as large as Marlon Brando, a revolutionary actor, cultural icon, and symbol of rebellious masculinity. Brando redefined what it meant to perform on screen. But while his talent captivated the world, his personal life spiraled into chaos, leaving behind a family legacy so troubled it bordered on Shakespearean tragedy. Brando fathered at least 11 children, some adopted, some biological, and his relationships with them were often fraught, inconsistent, and painfully distant. Among all his children, none would suffer the consequences of his legacy more than Christian Brando, his firstborn with actress Anna Kashfi. As a child, Christian was caught in the crossfire of a bitter custody battle between Brando and Kashfi, marked by allegations of kidnapping, emotional instability, and manipulation on both sides. The instability left Christian angry, confused, and deeply scarred. Despite Brando's best efforts later in life to reconnect, the emotional wounds never fully healed. But the most public and horrifying chapter came in 1990. Christian was convicted of manslaughter in the shooting death of Dag Drolet, the boyfriend of his half-sister, Cheyenne Brando. The case drew massive media attention, not only because of the crime, but because it revealed the deep dysfunction within the Brando household. Cheyenne, reportedly a victim of trauma and mental illness, later claimed she had been abused by Drolet, though the full truth was never legally established. Christian, in a fit of rage, shot Drollett in Brando's own home. Marlon Brando famously broke down in court, weeping as he tried to defend his son, while also grappling with the reality that his family life had descended into tragedy and violence. The image of the once mighty actor pleading before a judge remains one of the most haunting moments in celebrity legal history. The fallout was devastating. Cheyenne fell into a deep depression and died by suicide 5 years later. Christian served 5 years in prison, then spent much of his life struggling with addiction and health issues until his own death in 2008. Brando himself became more reclusive with age. His home, once filled with life and children, became a fortress of regret. In his later interviews, he spoke about failing as a father, a rare moment of raw self-awareness from a man whose life had always been larger than life. The legacy of Marlon Brando is undeniable on screen. But behind the legend was a family fractured by fame, haunted by tragedy, and left to carry the weight of secrets never meant for the spotlight. 14. Loretta King, a forgotten starlet and a child she was forced to hide. Her time in the spotlight was brief, but Loretta King left behind a mystery far more enduring than her Hollywood resume. Known mostly for her association with cult filmmaker Ed Wood and her leading role in Bride of the Monster, 1955, King never reached mainstream stardom. But what few realized was that her retreat from the industry had less to do with talent and more to do with a family secret that haunted her off-camera. Born in Phoenix in the 1920s, Loretta King arrived in Hollywood with dreams and determination. She secured small parts in stage and film productions, eventually catching the attention of Ed Wood, a director as infamous for his eccentricity as for his low-budget pictures. Their professional relationship quickly grew complicated. Some sources suggest King helped finance Bride of the Monster, and Wood allegedly rewrote the script to give her a starring role. But soon after the film's release, she vanished from public view. What wasn't known at the time was that Loretta had been dealing with an intensely private struggle. She had a child out of wedlock, something that carried intense stigma in 1950s Hollywood. Whether it was her own decision or forced by studio and family pressure, the child was kept secret, reportedly raised by relatives or placed in private care. The shame and societal pressure surrounding unwed motherhood during that era were enough to ruin a woman's career, or worse, mark her for life. For an actress like King, whose fame had not yet solidified, the fallout could be existential. So she stepped back, quietly. In later years, King resurfaced under the name Loretta King Hadler, occasionally attending Ed Wood fan events or conventions. But she never spoke openly about her child, her exit from Hollywood, or the choices she was forced to make. The public still saw her as a quirky footnote in cult cinema, while the truth of her life remained locked behind decades of silence. Loretta King passed away in 2007. She left no memoir, no interviews, no clarifications. Just a few grainy black and white frames and a legacy of a woman erased by expectations. Her story reminds us that in the golden age of Hollywood, silence wasn't always about discretion. Sometimes it was the only way to survive. 15. Susan Hayward, the mother who carried grief in silence. Fiery, fierce, and unforgettable, Susan Hayward lit up the screen with emotional intensity that few actresses could match. From I Want to Live to With a Song in My Heart, she earned critical acclaim and an Academy Award, solidifying her legacy as one of Hollywood's great dramatic talents. But behind her strength was a deeply buried pain, one she rarely spoke of, yet carried with her until the end. Hayward married actor Jess Barker in 1944, and in 1945, she gave birth to twin sons, Gregory and Timothy. To the outside world, she was living the Hollywood dream, a celebrated actress and a proud mother of healthy, happy children. But that illusion shattered when one of the twins suffered a devastating medical trauma in infancy, details that were never fully revealed to the public. Some accounts suggest that one of her sons nearly died in early childhood or suffered a condition that left lasting complications. While the specifics remain closely guarded, what is known is that Hayward became emotionally withdrawn during this period, throwing herself into work while her marriage rapidly declined. By the early 1950s, she and Barker divorced in a bitter court battle, with Susan winning full custody of the twins. From that point on, She became intensely private about her family, rarely allowing the press or colleagues even a glimpse into her personal life. The grief over her son's condition, and later the unexpected death of one of her sons in adulthood, remained unspoken in interviews, biographies, and even her Oscar acceptance speech. She appeared on red carpets with grace, but those closest to her recalled moments of haunting silence and a lingering sadness she never fully articulated. In the final years of her life, as Hayward battled brain cancer, a condition some have controversially linked to her time filming The Conqueror near nuclear test sites, she retreated almost entirely from public life. Her surviving son, Gregory, kept her legacy alive but rarely gave interviews. The heartbreak remained a closed chapter, hidden between the pages of Hollywood history. For an actress known for playing women under siege, on trial, on the verge, under pressure, Susan Hayward's greatest performance may have been off-screen, a mother's resilience, forged in grief she never allowed the world to see. Number 16. Robert Walker, a star's breakdown that left his family in pieces. To audiences, Robert Walker was the boyish, sympathetic everyman of Hollywood's 1940s films. But behind the screen presence was a man gripped by mental anguish and emotional collapse, one that would devastate not only his career, but his family, especially his two sons. Walker is perhaps best remembered for his chilling performance as Bruno Antony in Hitchcock's Strangers on a Train, a role that eerily mirrored the internal chaos he was experiencing in real life. By the time he filmed that movie, Walker had already endured a psychological and emotional collapse following the disintegration of his marriage to actress Jennifer Jones, a divorce that shattered him both personally and professionally. Their split wasn't just a standard Hollywood heartbreak. Jennifer Jones had fallen in love with producer David O. Selznick, one of the most powerful men in the industry. Selznick not only took Jones as his wife, but also took complete control of her career, rebranding her and elevating her to superstardom. For Walker, the betrayal ran deep. He had supported Jones during her early years, and now he was watching her thrive, while his own life unraveled. Walker began drinking heavily. He suffered a nervous breakdown, and close friends claimed he never truly recovered from the loss. His emotional instability affected his work, his friendships, and most painfully, his relationship with his children, especially Robert Walker Jr., who would later become an actor himself. In 1951, Robert Walker died suddenly at age 32 after being sedated by his psychiatrist. The official cause of death was a reaction to a sedative, but the deeper cause, grief, addiction, emotional collapse, was impossible to quantify. His son, Robert Jr., was just 11 years old at the time. Later in life, Robert Jr. would speak of his father's brilliance, but also his fragility. He described a man who was intensely emotional, full of conflict, and deeply wounded. The trauma of losing a father so young, under such painful circumstances, cast a long shadow over his own life and career. Robert Walker's legacy is complicated. A gifted actor whose life was cut short, a father who loved but couldn't protect, and a man undone by heartbreak that never healed. In the end, it wasn't fame that consumed him. It was the personal sorrow that no amount of applause could drown out. 17. Jane Wyman, the silent heartbreak of a child sent away. Long before she became a soap opera matriarch on Falcon Crest, Jane Wyman had carved out a solid career in Golden Age Hollywood. An Oscar-winning actress with performances in Johnny Belinda and Magnificent Obsession, she was known for her restraint, dignity, and understated emotional power. But behind the polished facade was a wound that rarely made it into the headlines, a child whose presence was quietly erased from her public life. Before she married Ronald Reagan, yes, that Ronald Reagan, Jane Wyman had a daughter from an earlier relationship. But the child, born deaf, was reportedly placed in the care of a specialized institution early on. The girl, named Maureen, suffered from a medical condition that required significant care, and in a time when disabilities were widely misunderstood and stigmatized, Hollywood's publicity machine did what it always did. It made the problem disappear. Jane and Ronald Reagan would later adopt another son and have children together, but Maureen's story remained largely unspoken. Though Jane never publicly denied her daughter, she also rarely acknowledged her, especially during her prime acting years. Unlike her other children, Maureen was almost completely absent from press clippings, interviews, and biographies written during Wyman's career peak. Some close to the family suggested that the choice to place Maureen in specialized care came from a place of concern, not cruelty. Jane may have believed her daughter would receive better attention away from the chaos of Hollywood, but still, the emotional cost of that decision lingered in the silence. As Jane Wyman's life moved forward, through her marriage and divorce from Reagan, her evolving career, and her turn toward religious devotion in her later years, this chapter of her life remained largely sealed. She spoke often about motherhood in interviews, but never about loss. Her on-screen roles often portrayed women who endured heartbreak with grace, and perhaps, just perhaps, those performances carried a truth she couldn't put into words. She died in 2007, having outlived Reagan and many of her peers. But the child she once had and seemingly let go of remains a poignant, rarely discussed part of her story. In old Hollywood, image was everything. And sometimes that meant hiding even the most personal truths from the world and from oneself. Chapter 18. Barbara Stanwyck, the son who was written out of her life. To the outside world, Barbara Stanwyck was the epitome of independence and self-reliance. Known for her steely performances in Double Indemnity, Stella Dallas, and The Lady Eve, she commanded the screen with sharp intelligence and unshakable presence. But behind her ironclad image was a deeply private heartbreak, one that revolved around a son she once called her own, and then later, did not. In 1932, Stanwyck and her first husband, actor Frank Fay, adopted a baby boy named Dion Anthony Fay. At the time, it was seen as the next step in building their Hollywood dream, two rising stars creating a family together. But the fairy tale began to unravel almost immediately. Frank Fay struggled with alcoholism and abuse, and their marriage turned toxic. They divorced in 1935, and Barbara was granted custody of Dion. As Stanwyck's career soared, her relationship with her son quietly deteriorated. Colleagues later recalled that she was a devoted worker, but emotionally distant as a parent. Dion reportedly grew up mostly under the care of nannies in boarding schools, rarely seeing his mother. By the time he was a teenager, the two were barely in contact. Eventually, something irreversible happened. Stanwyck cut ties entirely. No public explanation, no statements. Dion disappeared from her life and from the media. She never spoke of him again. Not in interviews, not in biographies, not in her late career retrospectives. It was as though he had been erased. Dion Fay, for his part, remained out of the spotlight. He lived a quiet life and never capitalized on his famous lineage. In rare conversations, he reportedly expressed confusion and sadness over his mother's coldness, but he never lashed out publicly. He died in 2006, just a year before Stanwyck was posthumously honored with a U.S. postage stamp. Why did Barbara Stanwyck cut her son out of her life? Theories abound. Some suggest it was her need for control. Others point to emotional scars from her own traumatic childhood. She had been orphaned by age 4. Whatever the cause, the pain was real. Not just for Dion, but for a woman who seemed unable to embrace vulnerability, even with her own child. Barbara Stanwyck was known as one of the greatest actresses of her generation. But even she couldn't perform the role of mother the world expected from her. And in Hollywood, some stories are tragic not because they explode, but because they're silently buried. 19. Robert Taylor, the actor who hid the truth to protect his career. With his chiseled jawline and stoic demeanor, Robert Taylor was the ideal leading man of Hollywood's golden age. He starred alongside Greta Garbo, Vivien Leigh, and Ava Gardner, and he did it all with a cool, unwavering presence that made him a fan favorite. But while he was adored by millions, Taylor carried a lifelong secret, one he kept buried beneath layers of studio polish, personal denial, and strategic silence. Taylor was married for nearly 2 decades to screen legend Barbara Stanwyck, a union that captivated the public and was heralded as a model Hollywood marriage. But behind the scenes, their relationship was far more complicated. Friends and insiders noted that Taylor often seemed distant, both emotionally and physically. Whispers surrounded their union almost from the beginning, that it had been arranged by MGM to protect Taylor's carefully cultivated image. Throughout his career, rumors persisted that Taylor may have been struggling with his sexual identity, or at the very least, that he had relationships the studio worked hard to suppress. In an era when even the faintest suggestion of homosexuality could destroy a career, MGM's publicity department moved swiftly to protect their golden boy. His marriage to Stanwyck was not just romantic, it was strategic. Insiders claimed the two led largely separate lives, and when the marriage eventually ended in 1951, both stars declined to explain why. Stanwyck remained silent on the matter for the rest of her life. Taylor remarried soon after to German actress Ursula Thiess and started a second family. Yet even then, he remained tight-lipped about his personal life, refusing interviews that veered too close to home. Taylor also faced criticism in later years for testifying before the House Un-American Activities Committee in the 1950s. He named names, something many fellow actors never forgave. Some believed his cooperation was an act of political conviction. Others suspected it was a way to deflect attention from his private life, to reinforce his loyalty and American values in an increasingly paranoid industry. He died in 1969 of lung cancer, still considered one of the great romantic leads of his time. But his legacy is tinged with sadness, not because he was disgraced, but because he was never allowed to be fully himself. Robert Taylor played heroes, cowboys, and noble lovers, but his most demanding role may have been his own life, lived in quiet compromise.